Greetings and welcome to another special episode of Genre Grinder. My extra special guest today is Bill Ackerman. Say hello, Bill, and tell the listeners what you do.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I am Bill Ackerman, the host of Supporting Characters podcast. I interview people that took their love of film into some form of project or vocation, whether it be film criticism, podcasts, film programming. That's been on hiatus this year, so I've been guesting on other people's podcasts. I've been on recent episodes of Directors Club, Projection Booth, Pure Cinema. I've been doing home video work off and on. I've done a couple commentaries, some booklet essays. So that's some of what I do.
Yeah, I believe the one I have is The Last House on the Left Arrow commentary is the one of yours I have on my shelf.
Yeah, for horror, I've done the booklet essays for the Arrow editions of Scalpel and Phantasm, the box set with the sphere.
Right.
And did Last House on the Left, and I did Fade to Black for Vinegar Syndrome with Amanda Reyes. Al Adamson, the Severin box set, she and I wrote the book that comes with that.
Yes.
So a couple horror releases.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about a subject that is close to my heart, but even closer to Bill's heart. And that, and I was trying to figure out a way to do something that's his. So we're not going to really cover a genre as much as a sort of movement. And we're going to call it the alternative American horror movies of the 1970s. These are going to be, we assume that you've already seen The Exorcist and Chainsaw Massacre and Dawn of the Dead. And we're going to try to get into the deeper recesses of what makes this era, the sort of post hippie era, basically, of independent horror and in the Americas, because we're going to cover at least one Canadian film, so special. And I think this subject is come into greater focus recently for two reasons, and I guess not that recently, but in 2007, Stephen Thrower wrote a book called Nightmare USA: The Untold Stories of Exploitation and Independence. This massive coffee table book that was very popular and sort of brought a lot of these forgotten movies kind of back into the zeitgeist for people, my age and younger. Like, I was born in the 80s, so a lot of these movies were either on video or were just forgotten flat out, or were like some sort of budget label thing that you would find and just not want to watch because they didn't put any effort into the box art or whatever. And then more recently, Arrow Video has started putting out something called the American Horror Project, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think Stephen Thrower is involved with the production of those in some level.
Yeah, he's curating those with, I think, you and Kant at Arrow. I think
Okay.
the two of them put those together.
And Thrower is an interesting person to cover this because he is British, and so it's kind of neat looking at it through his eyes. But it's very specific. This is a very specific flavor of movie, even if it doesn't sound like it off the top.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, I think even before Nightmare USA, I kind of grouped a few of the films we're talking about today together in my head, and I could never quite figure out, like, verbalize, like, what connects this kind of mostly dreamy but not overtly surreal kind of regional horror of the 1970s. I sometimes it feels like it's, a lot of things are drawing from Roman Polanski's influence, like Rosemary's Baby and Repulsion, or other art film directors like Ingmar Bergman, like studies of madness and psychosis. Since talking about authors, I would also say that Kayla Janice with the House of Psychotic Women has covered a few of these in her book.
Yes.
And so I think that also helped to shine a light on certain titles we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, in fact, I have a note here for the titles. When I read that book, I actually read that book not realizing it had a autobiographical slant to it. I just found it and thought it was just, and so that was a very special book to me because it had the autobiographical slant, and it sort of recontextualized a lot of this stuff for me as a dude who mostly approached horror as the grossest shit I could find for a lot of my life, and sort of finally grew out of that in the last now almost 20 years now, I guess. But that was another very important book. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I've interviewed both Kayla and Stephen Thrower on supporting characters, and so I've talked to them about the origins of both books. And that only kind of just deepened my. I mean, they were already favorite books of mine anyway, but
Right.
yeah, no, yeah, no, I think yeah, because I can identify like a lot of 70s horror films that I love that don't fall into this category. Like, I mean, I love all the Halloween and
Right.
uh, I know that I like The Last House on the Left more than you do, but like those kind of rougher horror films, I do like those as well. But I think the things we're talking about today are mostly uh, more often than not gentler films, I think.
Yeah. I kind of the one thing I after I got through everything I was watching here and revisiting, I sort of was reminded that when I was talking to Jim about the Invasion of the Body Snatchers from '78,
Mm.
that I read that personally as a movie about counterculturalists who age up and are out of the summer of love and the supposed revolution, and they don't like what they see, and it's sort of their way of finding every other way to deal with the problem instead of working on themselves.
Mhm.
And I think there's that sort of disillusionment in, well, in Dawn of the Dead in particular, but in these movies too. And something that makes them special is that they're not necessarily expressing it as concretely as that.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think that that's definitely a theme that carries over something like Let's Scare Jessica to Death or Messiah of Evil to some extent. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of them have that feeling.
And then it's also the '70s were the moment when like B horror movies became big, huge A movie production blockbusters. So everybody always blames Jaws for, ruining the world by creating the blockbuster, but at the same time, it also made, I assume it made studios, smaller studios, independent studios, more willing to explore the idea of adult horror, and genuinely weird movies sort of escaped from, in these days, there's probably a million straight to streaming movies that I'm never going to watch in my entire life,
Hmm.
and but there's probably like 8 on there that are actually really special movies, but because there's not like a system putting them in theaters, they're sort of like there's just something about the this sort of pre-video era where there's not a lot of room for too many movies, so they got to be a little bit careful about what they release, but they also want product, and they know that there's a new kind of audience out there for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just looking over before we talked today. I was just looking at the years that we're talking about, just to see what else was going on in horror in these years. And I mean, it's the time that you have, the rise of the post crystal plumage giallo boom. You have the eco horror films like not just Jaws, but things like Frogs and Grizzly. You
Hmm.
have the kind of last gasp of the Hammer Amicus kind of like classical British horror. You have the rise of all these kind of maverick European directors like Jean Roland and Jess Franco, and you have Paul Naschy. You have um, just so many different kinds of horror. And, yeah, all kind of reaching their heydays, and like the by the end of the decade, you get into the influence of Halloween and the rise of the slasher movies. But there's so many like idiosyncratic films that just because they have a vampire element, or they have a zombie element, or they have a like a post psycho kind of serial killer element. Um, just if they can satisfy some basic generic requirement, they're allowed to be quite unique and personal films sometimes.
Correct.
Yeah, I think Kim Newman writes pretty well about. I mean, this era as far as like. The rise of auteurs, really. I mean, of
Hmm.
independent writer directors, like whereas that wasn't really uncommon in the '60s and earlier. I mean, it was more driven by studios or producers. I mean, even someone like Herschel Gordon Lewis, who's a director we would know. I mean, that's heavily informed by his relationship with certain producers. Um, I would think that I don't know like if there's like one particular I mean, also the freedom of being able to make things with the R rating, the fall of censorship, I think kind of
Hmm.
emboldened a lot of a lot of maverick talents like the Toby Hooper, Wes Craven, George Romero. And I guess one thing that we had decided before sitting down today was that we were going to leave out the masters of horror kind of bigger directors like Don Coscarelli or George Romero. Well, we have one George Romero, but
We
leaving
do.
out Toby Hooper and John Carpenter and Wes Craven, and
Correct.
um, some of those directors made some great stuff in the 70s. Obviously, classics in the 70s
Right.
also.
And really influential movies too, but they felt like stuff people already know, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that there are 100 fantastic podcasts on those on one of those movies alone,
I
So
think you're right.
yeah, I was hoping we could dig a little deeper, and we actually ended up with a lot in common with these movies. So I'm gonna get into I'm gonna do these like I usually do. I'm gonna do them in chronological order.
Mhm.
In this case, sometimes that is confusing because some of these movies were filmed and not released for a very long time. So I did my best as far as that goes. So the first one was one I hadn't seen before this, Dream No Evil from 1970, which sort of sets the bar for the idea of um, it's sort of avant-garde sensibility. Uh, but it feels like someone was trying to make a mainstream movie in the process is the way I kind of approached this one.
Yeah, I mean, this was, since we mentioned Nightmare USA, this is one of two films we're talking about that I discovered through that book. And actually, the career of John Hayes in general, I didn't really know. I had seen Garden of the Dead and Grave of the Vampire like independently, but I had no idea that there was like a
A connect.
director to pay attention to. Yeah, no, I read about it in that book, and it took me a little while to track it down, and it's just so captivatingly odd to me. Like it's one of
Hmm.
the weirdest horror movies, if you can even, I guess you could call it a horror movie. I mean, it does have murders and a delusional character, but it's so serene and quirky that it's hard to it. You hear a title like Dream No Evil and you think of things like Fear No Evil. Maybe like you think of
Yeah.
something a little bit more straightforward. It's really not. It's maybe
Or
one of the weirdest things on our list.
and like the basic idea is almost like if you explain it to someone, it sounds almost like a Nightmare on Elm Street or what's that's the Slayer, that slasher
Oh yeah,
movie
yeah.
about the dream beast that attacks people. It sort of sounds like that's what it's going to be about.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but it's I wrote in my notes here. I wrote it's a ride, but it's not a roller coaster. It's more like a lazy river that just sort of keeps getting more and more weird the longer you're on it. It's like it doesn't have like the big, like it's not like being on a dark ride. There's not like booze. It's just things are starting to slowly dissipate and get weirder, and like the plot never really falls away. I suppose it has more plot than a lot of these movies actually.
But it has like very, I mean, I don't know if we're going to overuse the term dream logic with a lot of these
Yeah.
films, but this has maybe the most like this has storytelling that feels like they've made it up from scene to scene in not in a non-interesting way, but it's never predictable as far as like where it's
Yeah.
going.
Yeah. And I mean it's also allowed, I guess, to have dream logic because it is about someone's dreams dictating the logic that they're experiencing, I guess. um uh And the problem is that I at a certain point I watched all these in a row, and I should say, maybe people can hear it in my voice. I have a cold that turned into a sinus infection, and there's something about watching a bunch of movies like this in a row, while not feeling quite right, that they sort of become a mud in your brain, and like I don't want to I don't want to say definitely watch these movies while sick, but like it sort of does add something to them. It sort of makes them. Uh, feel more dangerous almost because you're already a little bit out of it. I
Yeah.
suppose the more safe way of doing that would be to just watch them while high. I didn't think that part through, but
Well, I don't know if you've ever heard Stephen Thrower talk about the origins of Nightmare USA, but he was sick when I think he had like a stomach bug or something, and he was like detained on the couch, and his initial research for it was just watching these movies while ill. And
uh-huh.
he had said that that a lot of them he felt like the effects of them were analogous to drugs, as far as
Yeah.
like the like the wooziness of the storytelling. So maybe, I mean, I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing to watch these while sick, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, and some of them are clearly going for a sort of New Hollywood, let's get high and watch the movie kind of vibe.
Hmm.
I don't think this is one of them though. I think this one really is sort of just like, it's like, okay, it's like being on the Small World, but it starts as like an East of Eden themed Small World,
Hmm.
and then it just sort of turns into this supernatural horror thing, but then it sort of goes back to being sort of down home folksy kind of tale, and then no wait, we're going back this, and so like there's a point where this woman brings her like so there's this I should describe the plot if I can. The simplest way is that there's this traveling carnival tent revival basically, which is alone a very inherently American thing from what I could tell. Cursory research seems to say it was a Methodist and Pentecostal thing that I'm sure there's traveling religious leaders since the dawn of time, but this is the kind of thing you see in a lot of Americana and American Gothic kind of stuff. Like there was just in The Devil All the Time, and then movies that aren't even supposed to be upsetting, like Benjamin Button has a big part of this sort of faith healing stuff in it. Anyway, so it seems to be it's about this, but it's actually about like after this this it's like past the heyday of this event, and it's sort of being run by two pseudo siblings that don't really even believe, and you think that's what the story is going to be, but it's really more about this woman who's convinced her father who left her when she was a child is going to be in one of these towns where she stops, and then she sort of wills that into being, I guess is a way to I would put it. So you go from like just scenes of people sort of talking about religion in really snarky terms, like this is they're just in it for the money, to this one basically willing her dead father back to life, and then he goes on a killing spree sort of, or you think he's going to go on a killing spree, but then he just sort of goes back to his life and dons a squeeze box and plays an Irish jig for a while.
Yeah, I mean, and you didn't mention that she finds her father again on a slab,
Yes.
in a like in a funeral parlor run by a pimp that hangs out in a place for old men.
Yeah, it's like yeah, it's specifically a funeral parlor slash prostitution house aimed at old men, and it's like and this old men thing, this is going to come up a lot, but there's like these towns that seem to be only inhabited by old men.
Yeah, there's a
Is
couple.
sort of a
Well, I
thing
was
here.
I was writing down like themes that overlap with the various films, and like this is one of the many films that like have like father kind of searching, and
Hmm.
also unwitting murderers. And
Yeah.
to some extent, like the trauma thing, this is the traumatic childhood. But I mean, there's a lot that will tie this to something like Witch Who Came from the Sea, but totally different approaches.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and uh it's also sort of framed like a morality play. The kind of the religious thing kind of gives it a slant. There's like those uh Patrick and I were talking about this when we were talking about slasher movies that aren't really slasher movies. There was a series of I believe it was I can't remember who did them now that I'm thinking about it, but there was like these movies that they would do church revival. They would show this movie about about the dangers of marijuana or whatever.
You
And
talking about like uh, if footmen tire you, what will horses do? Like that kind of
yeah,
thing.
that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah. Because there was a Day of Judgment, I think, was that
Yeah,
one
that's the
slasher
one. That's
movie.
the one. Thank
Yeah.
you. Day of Judgment.
Hmm.
It feels like the kind like it's going to be that kind of thing that just happens to be a horror movie, but it keeps switching gears, and it never really is particularly interested in Christianity. Like Grace, the main character, is a zealot, but not for Jesus, and her brother slash secondary love interest slash boss is clearly in it for the money and just faking the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and then well, also the one other note I have is that the actual love interest is I can't remember if he's a professor or at the college or if he's just like a student aide of some kind.
He's like
Um,
a med student.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's this second character that they introduced that he has a relationship with, and she's introduced in a way that it's, I guess that it's supposed to be that she's just worn out from studying, but it's almost like she's like supernaturally like damaged or something. Like she's
Yeah.
like, I kept on thinking that her being so upset about getting water on her when they forced her to take a shower was going to be a plot point later, or that her and Grace were going to have some sort of psychic battle. Um, but it just sort of was like a scene they had in mind, I guess, that they were going to have to wake this girl up and make her take a shower.
Yeah, I mean, there's very few scenes in it that aren't quirky in some way. I mean,
Yeah,
there's not a lot of scenes of just normality being disrupted by anyone's kind of behavior. Like every scene is a little bit offbeat.
right. And then it just sort of ends like it ends like a lot of these movies where it's a woman has been driven mad and murdering people, basically. um, it's a little less gentle about that part of it, I guess.
Yeah,
So,
but it definitely feels like in some ways like a '60s horror film to me. I mean, it's
mhm.
right at the beginning of the decade, so it still feels like a little bit kind of restrained compared to, I mean, even the things that come the following year, and
Mhm.
even compared to things that John Hayes does later. I mean,
Right. Yeah, I
but
think that I'm sure that plenty of people have seen the vampire movie he did.
Grave of the Vampire,
Yeah,
I remember renting it at Blockbuster in the
yeah,
'90s.
yeah. It was easy. I think that it must have been like copyright free or something because I remember there being multiple copies of it.
Yeah,
I
and Alpha Video and all those labels used to put out
hmm
Grave of the Vampire. I think
Yeah,
now there's a good version from Shout Factory, but yeah, it used to be just one of those, in every like budget pack kind of
yeah,
release.
exactly. Yeah, and then DVDs started to do like get 20 horror movies for $1 or whatever it was, and it would be on some of those too. Yeah.
Yeah.
the I also made a note which isn't really pertinent, but I just the traveling I kind of wanted the traveling uh Pentecostal or whatever it is religious show to play a little bigger role than it did, because it felt like it was going like on the level of something like Lord of Illusions has this sort of cult thing going on, like, and then there's this really great episode of the Superman animated series
Hmm.
where a Lovecraftian alien parasite comes to Smallville, and Supergirl comes back to visit and realizes her everybody has been sort of taken over by this scary preacher guy that's actually this giant parasite. and and then apparently there's a 1982 TV movie by Gary Sherman called Mystery 2 about aliens posing as cult leaders,
Hmm.
uh, which sounded kind of like it was in line with this kind of thing. It's an interesting idea that should be in more horror stories, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, if when you had said about what that traveling carnival does, but it's that combination of like a religious sermon and like a trapeze act that I
Yes.
couldn't tell if there was any basis in reality. If that was just I assumed it was just like a fancy of the writer, but maybe
Yeah.
that kind of thing did exist somewhere. It wouldn't surprise me if it did. But all the stuff with the crowds feels like almost documentary like.
Uh huh.
But then other things feel like as stylized as something like Lemora, or something that
hmm
is like really super designed, but designed on a budget. Like it's a very low budget film, but it doesn't feel like
I mean, it has a
amateurish.
it has a stunt. Her whole thing is she jumps from very high, and it appears they might have. I mean, it could easily be a stunt double, but there's a couple of scenes where it looks like the actress herself does the little fall, the little trust God fall
Yeah.
into padding. It's not a particularly spectacular thing to see, but I, I guess I'm not one to judge. I've never been to a revival tent, so
No.
I don't know how fervent everything gets.
Yeah, no. And I would say like for anyone listening that hasn't seen it that is a horror fan, I mean this is almost more curious than like scary. It's not really even trying to be scary that often. It's just weird.
hmm
you know.
Well, And I was actually thinking that actually leads into Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which is the next one.
Hmm.
I think that Let's Scare Jessica to Death is, and it's something I try to do. I was just did this with Patrick when we were covering the horror movies of 1960. Is that I try to find some sort of Rosetta Stone to explain what connects these movies.
Hmm.
And I feel like Let's Scare Jessica to Death is not only one of the most popular movies we're going to cover, but it is the one with the most elements. And so, like, if you haven't seen Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which we're going to talk about in a second, see that first.
Oh yeah.
And then if you're into that, then start looking for Dream No Evil, which is on Tubi right now if you're okay with commercials. That's how
Yeah,
I
a few
watched
of
it.
them are on Tubi.
Yeah. I guess because Arrow has them and Arrow sells
Yeah.
stuff to Tubi.
Yeah, Let's Get Jessica to Death is the only hit of
Yeah.
the lineup. I mean, this actually made some money through Paramount. Everything else was not so lucky.
Well, and it was one of maybe two that I remember hearing about in like the early DVD days when this stuff was started, like people were starting to sort of remember this, and I would say Death Dream.
Yeah, the reason I even saw Let's Scare Jessica to Death at the time was because as a child I had seen a TV movie called The Initiation of Sarah that my babysitter was watching, and it had a scene where she was being pelted by mud, kind of like a ripoff of Initiation of Sarah is like a Carrie Goes to College TV
Mhm,
ripoff of Carrie, but like the scene that was ripping off the pig's blood scene was the scene of her being pelted with mud, and I didn't know what it was, but it like horrified me as a little kid. And so when I was older and renting horror movies, I was rent anything that seemed like it would have pranks or
mhm.
initiations, because I could tell it's like a college initiation thing. So anything that seemed like it would be like a hazing type of situation, I would rent hoping to find this scene. And Let's Scare Jessica to Death, because it had that title that sounded
Mhm.
like some kind of conspiracy or prankishness going on. That's what led me to rent it in the first place.
Yeah, and the title is actually kind of clever because it fits the so lengthy giallo, or there was also the Hush Hush Sweet
Yeah,
Charlotte.
yeah, the Who Slew Auntie Roo kind of.
Yeah, those like long titles, but it's also a bit of a red herring because this is a movie about a woman who has mental illness and is not sure what is real and what isn't. So even after the movie tells us what's actually happening, the title helps sort of keep, at least for me, in the back of my head, like, oh, or maybe people are just fucking with her for some reason, like we're gonna find out that the classic, if she kills herself, some her husband gets a bunch of money from some sort of uh life insurance policy or something.
Sure. Yeah, no, it definitely plays up the potential for like a gaslighting narrative or something that
Right,
and you don't know. Certainly the first time you watch it, you're looking at all certainly the husband's behavior, because we're seeing him so much through her eyes that
right.
we don't know how trustworthy or untrustworthy he is.
And she doesn't even trust herself, which is another thing. I think that it has a lot of overdub narration from her point of view, which
Hmm.
can be a little bit awkward, but it also really sticks us in her headspace.
Yeah.
Um, what's the actress's name? Zora
Zora
Lampert.
Lampert.
Her
Yeah.
performance is really good as far as what somebody who's experiencing mental distress and trying not to show the people around them that they are, because when I used to get anxiety attacks when I was a teenager, and that is the feeling you have, like, I'm not going to let anybody know I'm freaking out right now. She's so good at that I don't think it really needs the narration, but it also sort of adds something to the situation, this particular situation, how uncomfortable it is, and that feeling of jealousy, and when you're like, oh, this person I love is going to betray me, and there's nothing I can do about it, and that's sort of weird. That, and then also the self-talk that people do to try to get themselves out of mentally distressing situations. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that this one is, I mean, this is probably my favorite horror film, and
mhm.
I think that it's interesting because John Hancock comes from theater background. This is his first feature film. He had done a short film, but this was like his first proper uh, theatrical feature, and it was produced independently and then distributed by Paramount. And the next thing you know, he's doing things like Bang the Drum Slowly, and he becomes a Hollywood director. But he's working with mostly East Coast theater people, or someone like Zora Lampert was like, did work with like Lumet and Cassavetes, and it's not faces that you associate with genre films. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have that feel, and it's like the perfect like post Romero, post Polanski kind of American horror film. Like you're right that it kind of sets the template for um, a certain kind of thing that you see throughout the decade, and also the blending of acoustic and electronic music. I
Mm-hmm.
think is pretty interesting and pretty new for that time.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, Clockwork Orange had just come out the same year, and that's a big one that for electronic music and movies.
yeah,
So this is a very early adopter.
yeah. Walter Sear did the electronics for this, and I'm trying to think like what other. I think he might have been involved with Puzzle of a Downfall Child the year before, but like it's not really like it's all pretty new. I mean,
Hmm.
just not even in horror, but just in general, that kind of
Hmm.
scoring. Um, and yeah, I love that it is like one of the ultimate hippies growing up, and what do you do when you're trying
Yeah,
to make a life after the the counterculture Woodstock kind of thing has kind of crashed. You move to small town, and you encounter hostility. It's a different kind of thing than Messiah of Evil, but it's the same theme of like the small town kind of rejects this generation.
yeah. All the small town of nothing but old men
Yeah.
happens again.
Yeah.
uh,
And it also, this is at a time when the vampire movie is going to have like a major resurgence. I think Count Yorga Vampire is the year before. It's
yeah,
1970, and then it's also 1970 is also the year of the Vampire Lovers, and Hammer kind of reinventing itself as a sexier, R-rated kind of
yeah.
take on that thing.
Something the kids will like. Yeah, Hammer trying to say, "Hey kids, we're not stuffy."
Yeah, yeah. And 71 is also the year of the Velvet Vampire and
Hmm.
Vampiros Lesbo. So it's like Daughters of Darkness, like vampires become like like a useful kind of genre framework. Like, and something like Let's Go Jessica to Death doesn't have fangs or bats or
Hmm.
capes or coffins. So you don't even necessarily always think to put it in that category, but it is
Right.
one of those. I mean, it's things like she stays because she's invited to stay. Is she a vampire, or is it just um, Jessica's kind of imagination? I mean, it plays with that ambiguity the whole way through. But yeah, it's a great. I mean, it's super atmospheric, and I think it's a great like afternoon horror.
Yeah. Well, and all those movies you mentioned, almost all of them are loosely based one way or another on
Carmilla,
Carmilla,
yeah, yeah,
which is uh, yeah. I guess there was a official version of that made in 1960, I think, Blood and Roses,
yeah,
but
yeah.
is otherwise just this sort of like there might. I mean, there's okay, that's not true. There's definitely more Dracula movies than Carmilla movies, but there's a whole
There's a lot of
but
Carmilla movies.
there's a lot of them, and if you know the story, this one's actually a very clever updating of it,
Yeah,
because a lot of them like Vampire Lovers take it and sort of just take the story part and then really amp up the lesbian part.
which this really does not do at all.
No, this doesn't, and I have no problem with it ramping up the lesbian part. And those sapphic vampire movies are some of my favorite movies, actually.
Oh yeah, they're great.
The ones you've mentioned. But this has it feels like the 1971 version of that story in a way that you almost don't even if you're familiar with the story, you don't notice how many things that they're actually having in common. I mean, yeah, it was something that I didn't even think of the first couple times I saw it, and then I read somewhere that it was a loose update of Carmilla, and I'm like, what? No, oh yeah, I guess. I mean, Emily is like the '60s bohemian Carmilla. Did escape to northeastern America, and just made this town her own.
And it's so interesting because it wasn't even written to be that. Because it was it Lee Kalkheim or Kalkham? I don't know. I've never actually had to say
Yeah.
his name aloud before. But he wrote the script. It was like it drinks hippie blood or something like that. That was like
Uh-huh.
a monster in the lake kind of thing. That it had the hippie thing, but it was like this. I mean, it sounded like a bad horror comedy.
Yeah.
and John Hancock, I think, just threw it out and like kept like the skeleton of it and made and then brought I think brought the Carmilla thing to light that you're talking about, and I think that's it's just so funny that would have like this really kind of cheesy kind of origin that becomes this like kind of melancholy, really well acted, like
Hmm.
heavy hearted kind of ghosty kind of feeling movie. And it's been nice to see it getting uh, renewed attention in recent years. I think Kayla's book definitely helped.
Hmm.
Um,
It's
you
on the
know,
cover
it's
of
on the
both
cover of one
versions.
edition, and then
Yeah.
Criterion put it in one like 70s lineup, and the recent Blu-ray. So it's people are getting more aware of it. I mean, when I've showed it to people back in the day, I think sometimes it was a little too subtle for some of my friends that were looking for
Yeah.
more proper, like visceral horror.
I I do think that this one is one case where there wasn't like a specific, like a lot of times like Criterion or back in the day Anchor Bay would release something that they got their hands on because whoever was in charge of buying, like, no, this is important, people need to see it, and it
Mhm.
would suddenly get a reprisal. uh I think this one has been like sustained word of mouth since its release that just keeps building and building because it's a huge thing in Kim Newman's
That's his
night.
favorite horror movie as well.
Yeah, I mean, nightmare movies. It's like, speaking of Rosetta Stones, it's like the Rosetta Stone of that book.
Yeah.
Um, and that was the first time I had ever heard of it. Is I just happened to pick up that book at a used bookstore one day, looking for something to, because I was like, I need to get more educated on horror movies and look into stuff that's not just new, and so that's where I figured out what it was. But I don't think I think it's been, because it didn't even get a Blu-ray release until 2 years ago, a year and a half ago.
And the
Uh,
DVD that came out from Paramount was like misleadingly covered and like
mhm.
came out very belatedly, no extra features on it. I think because it's a studio title, it didn't have the same, for better or for worse, it wasn't passed around the way like
Right.
certain independent titles are with these boutique labels. They didn't have access to it, at Arrow and Blue Underground and
Yeah.
whoever. um error, but so I, I think, and that happens with a few of these, like if they don't have that same kind of curation from a Criterion or a genre movie Criterion equivalent, that can hurt them. But yeah, no, Kim Newman has definitely been banging the drum for this film for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess back to my point that I was saying a while ago about how Invasion of the Body Snatchers
Mm,
is sort of the movie that speaks to me about what my parents' generation, like how hippies became yuppies, basically.
mhm.
I think there's a lot of that, and this is almost like a companion piece, even more so than Dawn of the Dead, because it kind of, they both connect paranoia to real world mental illness. They're both cases where um, people are focused on mental illness and treatment of mental illness, and it's a scary thing in both cases.
Mm.
And in both cases, there's a supernatural force that is triggering this for them, that might be real and might not be real. It's more explicitly real in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like there's never a point in Invasion of Body Snatchers where you're like, maybe this isn't really happening. But
No, no.
when by the time Let's Scare Jessica to Death ends, there's still a little nugget of maybe this didn't happen. um
Yeah, no, absolutely.
and and I mean, it doesn't connect to the what's the word I'm looking for, the consumer culture part
Mm-mm.
that Dawn of the Dead and does, but it still connects to that sort of like you said, loss of, like, now they're adults and they have to do something with themselves. Some of it's really obvious. They drive into town in a black hearse with the word love inscribed on the side,
Hmm.
and the angry old men in town scrape the word love off of but it's like sort of, it's a death of hippies. It's sort of image, and
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the way they take the ferry there, and that's a real ferry. I've taken that ferry because I've visited the locations for the film in Connecticut. But the way that the ferry is like the ritual to access the town feels almost like what is the name of that boatman? Like Charon or Charon, like
mm,
like the Grim Reaper figure taking them over to a to the forbidden land that they should not be
yeah.
traveling.
and then that feeds into the thing that I think is at the heart of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is this idea of a rural versus urban thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
depending on the movie, you're supposed to root for one or the other. Or the better movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they're both kind of in bad shape. But I made a note that I never noticed this, but the antique shop guy, who's the other human, quote unquote, in the movie, actually refers to them as refugees of urban blight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that I mean, that is they aren't like I guess that I always read them as New Yorkers.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's what I assumed.
I don't think they ever establish it, but I think that's how I always read it. Yeah, no,
But
it's trying to think what I even would compare it to from around that time. I mean, because I feel like there's things that come after it that remind me of it that are on
uh-huh.
this list, but I don't know. Even Rosemary's Baby or The Haunting is another one I thought of.
Yeah, well, see, I always think of Repulsion
Mhm.
as being the one, like the prime neurotic woman goes insane and may be a killer. But
Yeah,
um I was reminded while researching this that The Haunting and The Turn of the Screw both have that theme way before Repulsion did.
yeah.
But Repulsion is always the one that's in my mind, and I assume that a lot of these filmmakers had seen Repulsion.
It feels like he's like the biggest influence, and part of that could have been because Polanski, maybe because he was a European filmmaker, had like I don't think he was ever ghettoized as far as like being a horror director, even when
Right.
he was making horror films. That like he was always kind of a more prestige director, more of a an art house critical darling, at least
Hmm.
then. And things like The Tenant would sit perfectly well alongside some of these films.
Yeah.
So I think that some Bergman also could have inspired this. I don't know. Maybe I know Antonioni's an influence on one other film we'll be talking about.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that there's some highbrow influences mixed in with the Universal monsters and Hammer films that I think that horror was more identified with prior to this generation coming into prominence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a new Hollywood thing where all the new Hollywood sort of worshipped at the altar of what had just happened in Europe, and most of the new Hollywood that gets celebrated is non-horror, but
Yeah, but
stuff like this
that
was
same kind
happening
of
too.
auteur thinking was
Hmm.
happening at this level too. And not
I
just
mean,
even the directors we're talking about today, but even people like Jeff Lieberman and Larry Cohen. And
hmm,
I mean, there's a lot of unique writer director figures emerging.
yeah, I mean, and I don't think that there's something about Less Scared Jessica Death that does actually remind me of Cassavetes, just because there's something scary about Cassavetes movies to me that this movie also kind of captures.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there's
but
one of the ones we're going to be talking about. I feel like borrows like outright from, well,
hmm,
actually two borrow outright from Faces.
hmm, yeah, it's true. Um, so yeah, so this is the important one. Watch this one first. Maybe
Yeah.
we should even talk about it first. We talked about it second. That's good enough. So if you didn't have anything else to add on this, we can move on
No.
to
In fact,
1972's The Premonition.
or was it Premonition or The Premonition?
It's The Premonition. Yeah. Or no, Premonition. Gosh,
Yeah.
shit. Now I have it. Yeah, you're right.
We were
It's
talking about
easily
Alan
good.
Rudolph, right?
Yes, we're talking about the Rudolph movie. We're not talking about
The Robert
Robert
Allen
Allen,
Schnitzer movie from 1976.
right? Which is was included on the American Horror Project, which makes it even more confusing. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, Premonition is 1972. Alan Rudolph, and I thought this was this is a personal favorite of mine that has never really been has never enjoyed the reassessment of some of the other
yeah,
films we're talking about.
yeah. I watched a oven baked VHS rip on YouTube. That's the way I was able to see it.
Yeah, that's the only way you can see it now. I mean, it
Yeah,
had a VHS release and it had like a budget DVD release under the title Head, which I think was the shooting title. But
yeah. It says head on the version I saw. Yep.
yeah,
Not to be confused with the Monkeys movie,
yeah. Well,
which it has some stuff in common with,
it,
actually.
it does. It does. I forgot about that. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that this is kind of like Seizure in that but even like Oliver Stone will at least talk about Seizure. I don't know if Alan Rudolph ever gives interviews about his first two features in the horror genre.
Hmm.
Um And it's a shame because they're interesting films.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that made me kind of uh, realize is that Rudolph was working as an assistant director to Altman
Yeah.
on Long Goodbye, California Split, and Nashville, and so that there is a bit of that in this movie, um, especially Long Goodbye and Nashville. There's
Yeah, but this precedes the Altman
yeah,
collaborations. But yeah, you're right. I can see. I mean, the kinship, and I think he was assistant directing on like Brady Bunch or something prior to this. Like
yes,
he comes from like a Holly. Like I think his dad was a producer or something. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know that he had like industry ties in a way,
hmm
family. But yeah, and I thought it makes an interesting companion to something like Let's Scare Jessica to Death because again, it's an account of a traumatized survivor, and so the fantastic elements could be explained away by the memory, the unreliable memory of the protagonist,
hmm
um, but
or drug use.
or drug use, yeah. But so was this a new film for you? Had you
Yeah,
seen
I had never seen this. I had seen the other one,
the
the
Premonition? Yeah,
which I'm not a huge fan of. I
I know
thought
you
that
had
was
said. What did you think of this one?
I thought that this one was really interesting, and to me, the way I was going to describe it to people is that it sort of feels like there's a bog standard drama with comedic elements about a rock band, and it gets sort of invaded by a horror movie. Um,
Yeah.
and I've never taken LSD, but I imagine there could be cases of people watching harmless rock dramas under the influence that see them as this sort of horror film like this. Like they're not sure if they saw what they think they saw, that kind of situation.
Mm.
Um, and then it's funny that he did the Brady Bunch thing because there's something about, I mean, I guess it would make more sense if he had directed Partridge Family. Um, but there's still some sort of connection there with the sort of pop music thing,
Mm. Yeah.
that I found really interesting, and even the way the whole film is introduced in sort of narration by the main character. He sort of introduces it with a song and then speaks directly to camera throughout.
Yeah, like he's walking down the road, like playing an acoustic guitar, singing the song as the credits roll. And it's like, what is this? It's a guy named Carl Crow who I think died tragically, like later in the decade, like
Yeah,
died young. I think he might have drowned. I'm not sure, but it was like it made it more mysterious when I found out that guy, because he seems so haunted the entire time, even when he's like on more of an even keel. There's something kind of sad about his disposition as a would-be rocker.
yeah. And he never really seems like an actor. Like he seems like a rock guy that they just got to sit down and talk about this horrible experience he had.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, the way it's described, it's funny. The IMDb and Wikipedia description and YouTube description were like, hippies take a special. Hippies eat a red flower and they see their death, and then their death slowly, the death they've seen has slowly comes to be, which makes it sound like a Final Destination movie or
Yeah,
something.
no, yeah, it's a very misleading way to describe
Very
the
misleading.
movie.
Uh, yeah, it's really more about them sort of just falling apart emotionally on the road as a not super successful band is a lot when it comes down to.
Yeah, but they are having these eerie premonitions of death.
Hmm
And so it gives it like license to indulge in like these kind of eerie, like but like rural kind of images. But yeah, it's not really especially like there's not a lot of like tense sequences, and there's not a lot of violence. It's just it feels like that same kind of lost melancholy horror feeling of Jessica, but
hmm
transposed over to this kind of this rock band context. I always wondered if it was just like Rudolph wanted to tell a story about drug addiction destroying the counterculture music scene and needed to find a fantastic way to sell the idea.
like a
And
hook.
that's kind of
Yeah.
how it feels to me. Like it doesn't feel like a film concerned with being a proper horror film, but it pays enough attention to the genre that it has the scenes that mark it as a horror film, but allows a lot of time to let characters, you know, you know, exist and behave and like learn about their kind of little rivalries. And I don't know, it's just one of those. I don't even know like if it wound up an American Horror Project in the future, like what people would make of it, because it's again, it's like Dream No Evil. Like it's a horror film, but it's a different animal than something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's like meant to be like a real knuckle biting kind of suspense kind of situation. Like it's not like that.
And it's not really a comedy. It has some funny elements, but it's not really a comedy.
No.
Oh, another note I made is that by the end of it, it kind of feels like Rudolph watched Easy Rider and realized that if you sort of change the soundtrack of Easy Rider to droning keyboard music, it's a horror movie. Because I've always found Easy Rider, it's really disorienting and it is bleak and it ends with a shock ending.
Yeah.
So it's like, all you have to do is change a couple elements, and that sort of like mixed media improvisational approach to storytelling kind of fits.
That's interesting. I never thought about the Easy Rider connection, but he would have definitely been aware of it. So I mean,
everybody was.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that was an influence. I've always wanted to talk to Alan Rudolph about it, and I found his agent's contact information. I don't know if he still represents him. They're both like 90 years old now, so I don't even know like if he'd be more or less open to talking about those films, because I don't think he ever did any press about them. I could actually find very little evidence that it even played more than a few markets in theaters in the 70s. So he went on to make a film called Barn of the Naked Dead that is a lot more of a proper grindhouse exploitation title.
Yeah, that's one that, because of its title, and again, I think it did not have a copyright, because it was another one that you just see everywhere at a certain point.
Yeah.
So I thinking it also had some sort of copyright problems.
I mean, that's definitely a title that you can't ever forget.
Right. And I suppose if he feels ashamed, which he shouldn't, of either of those movies, that would be the one that you would kind of want to pretend you weren't a part of.
Yeah, I mean, that one definitely is a little bit more unpleasant, and that feels closer to something like Schoolgirls and Chains, like those kind of movies. And Premonition is such a different animal. I don't know. I mean, I was just glad to even have a chance to talk about it briefly on a podcast with somebody.
Yeah. Well, and it's a movie that I think that if anybody would just not, if I didn't have to just watch this VHS, not good VHS copy, that there's something more to it that I'm missing, is also what I feel. There's always something about that with certain types of movies that some VHS transfers really actually ruin, and others improve.
Yeah, but even if Code Red puts it out in like a beat up grindhouse print on Blu-ray, I'll buy it like for $30 the first day.
Yeah, of course. If it actually looks like film, maybe would help.
That would help.
Just tracking lines the whole time. And I also should say that there is a small tradition of like sort of hippie death trip movies.
Yeah.
That were in. So there's I Eat Your Skin, where sort of Manson family inspired hippies are fed poison meat and get rabies.
You're talking about I Drink Your Blood.
I said I Eat Your Skin. Yes, I Drink Your Blood, which I know is one of Patrick's favorites.
Yeah.
And then there's Blue Sunshine, about poisonous LSD that turns hippies into homicidal maniacs years later. And I always thought it was interesting that those were both a take on the zombie type movie.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
And so in the way that Let's Go Jessica to Death is a take on vampires, they are sort of a version of zombie movies where if say Dawn of the Dead hadn't come out at the end of the decade and been a huge hit, maybe we would have had less post-apocalyptic zombie movies and less movies about zombies that eat people, and more movies about chemical zombies or emotional zombies or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, and there's a little bit of zombie-ish action in Jessica also, with the old men as servants of the vampire woman.
Right. Yeah. But no, this is an interesting movie, and I do wish that it got a better presentation at some point. I
Yeah,
don't know.
no, it's I think if given the proper treatment and context, it's one that if people like the kind of films we're talking about, beyond the Jessica, but like things like Dream No Evil, it's worth tracking down, even if the versions you can find currently are not the greatest looking.
Hmm. And so then that will bring us to Images from 1972, which is almost cheating because it's not a master of horror, but it is a very famous filmmaker of this era, which
Yeah.
is Robert Altman. And he had made a sort of series of Bergman-esque movies in this period that aren't. This one's the one that's closest to just being a horror movie, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But he also did Three Women.
Yep.
And I would even say The Long Goodbye has a bit of a horror slant to it, because it's so disorienting. There's a lot of that story that's very disorienting.
Yeah, and That Cold Day in the Park is also
Mm-hmm.
pretty much a horror movie. But yeah, Images is the one that is closest to. I mean, it could play comfortably alongside all of these as far as like a post-Repulsion, Bergman influenced kind of horror movie. It is a horror movie.
Yeah, and I would put this one directly in line with Repulsion. I think this is the one that has it doesn't have those other influences that we were talking about in some of these other movies. This one is like his sort of take on Repulsion, I feel.
Yeah, I would say that of the films we're talking about today, this is the one that, even though it was probably not made for a lot of money, it has the most sheen to it. It's it's a big Hollywood director working with Vilmos Zsigmond on location. Like, it's not a I mean, it's the one that has the largest sense of scale. I think. And it's funny. I was, since we're on the Now Playing Network, I mean, I was on Directors Club once, and I was the sole defender of this movie on the Robert Altman 2.0 or whatever episode.
Oh, really? That's interesting to me, because I don't consider myself much of an Altman fan. I feel like I was really into stuff like Nashville and Shortcuts when I was like in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of lost interest in him, and getting this just randomly from Arrow to review. It was the first time I'd ever seen it, and it sort of turned me around on and made me want to watch more Robert Altman movies.
Yeah, I have to say that this didn't come out on home video back in the day, and I had to buy a bootleg tape off the guy that does the Shock Cinema magazine.
I was gonna, yeah. I don't think some people don't know that you had to actually trust the people in the back pages of zines and Fangoria and shit to actually deliver the things they that was most Italian horror movies, were like basically Lucio Fulci's 90% of his catalog, which even available catalog was gotten that way, and you would just pretend like the piece of shit you got was worth your however much money you spent.
Oh, sure. It was. I mean, it was serious, like risk taking, and it was at a Chiller convention that he had a table with like all these like little like lime green kind of video cassettes, and he sold me Three Women and Images, that way, because neither one of them came out. I think they had shown on maybe like the Z channel or something. So there's like these cable prints that like full frame. So if you can imagine that wandering Altman camera work, but in a pan and scan transfer, like that's how I saw these things. It was like, amazing that they kind of transcended that awful presentation. But and then it came out on DVD belatedly, and then Arrow did a beautiful Blu-ray of it.
Yeah, and that was what I had known nothing about it, so it came out of nowhere for me at the time, and it was like one of those like instant favorites. Like, oh, okay, this, like, why did the other people not like it? I thought Patrick did like this.
No. Well, it was the Brad and Al lineup of Directors Club.
Right, okay,
yeah. Jim and Patrick probably would like this. I don't know if I can't remember if they've seen it. I'm sure they probably have, but. Yeah, no. Well, I think even back in the day, like, it's not a film that like you would read about in Easy Rider Dredging Bowls or things like that. Like, it was kind of always because Altman was knocking them out like a film a year, I want to say, back in his post MASH heyday in the 70s, and I feel like Images barely got released, and it didn't really fit into that idea that people had of him as this smart aleck genius, kind of flipping genre conventions on their head. Like, I'll do the revisionist Western, the revisionist private eye film, the revisionist buddy movie, and the revisionist musical, like revisionist war comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Like it, Images sat totally on the outside of all that. I mean, even to the degree that like something like Brewster McCloud kind of fit into it. Like, I mean, it was
Right.
just because it wasn't really, I mean, it has like humor to it, but it's so solemn and grim and eerie. It just didn't
Mm-hmm.
make any sense for what people's idea of what Robert Altman was. That even though it won Best Actress at Cannes, I think, for Susanna York, it just, the distributor never really knew how to sell it and didn't bother. And even the fact that like he had that critical support, there wasn't really a way to make that. I had it been a wide release, I don't know if it would have been too strange even for 1972. But yeah, it was just one of those kind of almost lost in the shuffle kind of Altman films.
Yeah, and well, at the time, it was one of those things where between the House of Psychotic Women book, this coming out, and a couple other things, I sort of started to realize that some of my I cannot remember who it was, but there was someone who did a video, I believe, for Arrow, that has described giallo films as M gialli and F gialli.
Oh, is it Kat
It's a,
Ellinger and Sam Deegan?
no, it wasn't them. It was a man.
Oh,
I
okay.
can't remember who it was. No, it wasn't them. But anyway, it was this interesting idea that there are this male-driven giallo movies and female-driven, and this sort of the female-driven giallo movies, and how many of them are about like high society women who are breaking down
Like
and are
Umberto Lenzi kind of
suspicious.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and are suspicious of everything around. Like the ultimate one to me is Fulci's Lizard in a Woman's Skin, where she's not even sure if she's the killer or not. And I just realized that there's something about these movies, and Repulsion being one of them, but this movies we're talking about, and that connect a lot for me. And I don't know what that says about me. I feel like there's maybe an unintended sexism in that, but there's something about this specific type of movie that really works, and I think this is maybe almost the most pure version of that, where it's just about a woman who is dangerous because she's unaware and like sick of entitled men.
Yeah, but I would say also, just for fans of people like David Lynch that come later, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
imagery in this, a lot of situations that feel like his kind of horror, which
Mm-hmm.
is like, you're talking to someone, they walk into a room, they walk out, and it's another person. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like something that's so basic but so jarring. And
Yeah.
like the way that it like horror erupts in this film is actually quite startling.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that feels very fresh still. Like just like, I don't want to give away any of the horror punchlines to it, but it's got strong, unforgettable. I mean, like the title says, images.
Images. Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's practically jump scare, but not jump scare. That's not really the right word. But yes, I know exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Another weird connection it had for me when I first saw it was Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs.
Yeah.
And it's something about them being both. I think they're both taking place in Ireland. Maybe,
Yeah, they are.
and their vacation and American or not non-Irish people, and how they get isolated by the environment, and there's implied infidelities that make people more paranoid, and there's a sort of cruelty to all the men involved.
Yeah. No,
And
that's a good point of comparison.
I mean, Straw Dogs is a much more brutal and difficult movie than this, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
But there's still it's still something similar about them, and the fact that Peckinpah and Altman were kind of interesting characters too for what they did to the Western genre at the same time.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, not to go too much down that road. I mean, but there's a lot that would connect Altman and Peckinpah, even if they don't, like seem like obvious kinship. There's,
Hmm.
I mean, beyond the fact that they were both war vets of a different generation, kind of like like learned their trade in television, and then when this new Hollywood and all the attendant freedoms comes into it, they're in a different kind of headspace than the
Hmm.
Bogdanovich, Scorsese, Coppola, Spielberg, De Palma, like youngins. Like they're someone they've been in the game a while. They know that there's these rules that they're able to break are like freshly broken, and so I feel like they take greater risks than maybe the younger guys.
And they probably also hate each other personally.
They probably hate most people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess Peckinpah's like a real genuine nihilist, and maybe Altman's a sort of joke nihilist and ironic nihilist.
Certainly a bridge burner. I mean, they were both like the nightmares of the studios. I mean,
Right.
they both got into plenty of fights and seemed to thrive on the conflict.
Hmm.
But yeah, and you're right that these are both kind of expat-ish kind of productions for them. They're like, they're not usually associated with shooting out of America, and that's like
Right.
a rare case for both of them. But I never even thought you made the connection. Yeah, like literally Ireland of all places as well.
Yeah, yeah. It was, yeah, that was interesting. And I suppose Peckinpah never really did a horror movie, but Straw Dogs comes awfully
Straw
close.
Dogs. I mean, my one regret on the Last House commentary is I don't mention how much it owes to Straw Dogs.
Mm,
I mean, all the
that's
booby
true.
traps that
Yep.
Craven is
Yep.
identified with come from Straw Dogs.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but yeah, Images. I've always thought. I mean, I was actually really happily surprised that you mentioned that, because I sometimes, well, I wasn't sure how obscure we were going, and I guess this is kind of an obscure film, even though Altman was a really major
Right.
director at that point. Because it is kind of, and it has that tie to Network USA. Also, Stephen Thrower, is the one of the talking heads on the Arrow release.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I mean, it was just one that like really came together around when a couple years ago, when this whole idea was kind of forming in my head about this idea of all these movies in this same period about from different countries about women that are just sort of losing their mind, but they're not sure but they're horror movies. It's an interesting almost genre of itself, which I guess we could have tried to make this all about that, but is so much of it bleeds into these other movies that we didn't have to.
Yeah, I think when I talked to Stephen Thrower about Network USA, and I was talking about like films, in particular that had this kind of dreamy kind of feeling, he described them as like films that exist right on the edge of sleep. And
Hmm.
I think of Images as being like, as much as Dream No Evil, a film that feels like it operates on dream logic, as far as like how scenes play out, and like how coincidences, and like and because her point of view is so unreliable, like characters seem to come and go, and like doppelgangers, and like seeing herself, across the way, and seeing, you have to stay alert to follow what's going on, even though it doesn't
Right.
it doesn't play unfairly, as far as like it has surreal quote unquote imagery, but it's not nonsense. I mean,
It's not a Giallo movie where you would have no hope in hell of guessing who the killer was.
no, it's not like that.
Well, and another thing, I I should I should say from my point of view, as someone who has been in the hospital before and under medication, there's a it's not just dream logic, but it's like, yeah, it's that liminal space between dream and awake where you can't quite keep track. So like a whole day will go by and you aren't really sure what time of day it is, and then like when doctors and nurses come in, they have different shifts, but your brain isn't really aware that they have different shifts, so it does look like their faces are changing. um
Hmm.
and there's this sort of there's a scariness to hospitals that usually movies pick up on the scariness of death in hospitals, like most hospital horror movies are about a killer loose in a hospital or whatever,
Right.
or but there's something about not quite grasping, because it's not, you're not in your own home, but you're expected to sleep, I think that these movies kind of capture, and I suppose that's something The Exorcist does really well too, is this sort of idea that the supernatural and the natural traumas kind of interacting like
Well,
that.
it's funny that you mentioned The Exorcist, because I wonder if William Friedkin saw this, because there's a scene where she's in the house and hears like a banging upstairs
Hmm.
that feels like so similar to a scene in the opening of The Exorcist,
Yeah,
where she thinks it could be mice, but it could be something much worse.
yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't put it above. Fredkin seems pretty honest as far as things he borrowed.
He
So
might not
yeah,
even remember like where he got that idea, and it
yeah,
could be. I mean, and it's it's the old bump in the night kind of or bump in the upstairs. I mean, it could be coincidental, but it does hit the same hit the same tone that The Exorcist did, and that's one of my favorite moments in that film, the Friedkin film, because it's just
hmm
so simple and relatable.
hmm
Um, but I wanted to also just call out the score for this one because it's John Williams
yeah,
before he gets associated with the Spielberg Lucas kind of uh, big rousing kind of anthemic kind of thing. Like this is like almost avant-garde, and it has all of this
yeah,
kind of music concrete kind of experimental touches from a guy named Yamashita, I think, that almost kind of points towards things like Romero and Tobe Hooper movies as far as like just ratcheting up the tension through making strange non-musical sounds, like percussive sounds that don't feel like traditional scoring, and then kind of merging them with uh, a very kind of tense, unusual John Williams composition.
yeah. And hear interviews with Williams, and it always sounds like this is the kind of stuff he kind of wished he got to do his whole career.
Be amazing if Star Wars or Raiders of the Lost Ark had a score like this, but
Yeah, yeah. Then we'll move on to Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, which was also released as Legendary Curse of Lemora
Mhm.
and Lemora, Lady Dracula.
Oh yeah.
Um, it got a 1973 premiere release, but then it went wide in 74, is what it says here. Um, this and Let's Scare Jessica to Death are the only two that I feel like people were talking about regularly in the 90s, when I was really getting into horror as a younger person, and that I was told I had to find a way to see. And I think it eventually did get it was probably also Anchor Bay.
It was
Um,
Synapse.
Synapse.
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't have, I mean, I bought it from Michael Moore video and not that Michael Moore, different
Right.
Michael Moore,
Right.
that looked kind of like a pirate tape. I don't know, but it had like an exclusive interview on it. So it felt like some kind of missing link between bootleg and legit release. But
Right.
I had read about it in Danny Perry's Cult Movie Stars, because I was a big fan of Rainbow Smith, Cheryl Smith, the lead in this, and it
Mm.
was like this offbeat horror film that she was the lead actress in, and I knew her from sexploitation films like the Jack Hill movies, Swingin' Cheerleaders, and Massacre at Central High, and things like that. That she did later on, and people might know her from Cheech and Chong movies, or
She had a pop career, a pop music career in
she was
the
in the
90s.
Runaways briefly.
Yeah. She was in I caught up on this. It was when they made a movie about them, and they played themselves, and apparently some of the members didn't like the movie and they left.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
she could sing and play drums, so she was kind of tossed in there. I thought, yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
and that footage, which was an abandoned movie called "We're All Crazy Now," I think, became a film called Dubidio, which Ray Sharkey is in. But yeah,
Mm.
yeah, no, it was a film that took a while for me to track down, and then it was again like Three Women Are Images, like a film that I mean, when you're doing the bootleg thing, it's like you're rolling the dice, hoping you see something
Hmm.
good. And this was like, oh my god, this is like amazing. I couldn't believe how good it was. And so you had seen this in the '90s?
Yeah, I believe back in Arizona in Tucson where I grew up, there was a pretty good video store that still technically exists called Casa Video, and somebody who worked there put a lot of effort into having a horror section, a really nice horror section. Um, and I had just read about this probably in the really early internet is probably where I got this from,
Okay.
because I didn't watch horror movies until I was like 15 or 16 because I got anxiety attacks and they freaked me out, and then I got a medication, and so I had to like make up for lost time. um, and so I was old enough to get my own card to rent videos, and yeah, and so this was one on this like list I used to carry around of things you need to see, and I'm pretty sure I just got it off some early fan website or something of like I liked the idea of vampire movies that weren't very non-traditional, so I think I wrote it down on there.
Yeah. Yeah, this.
But I couldn't tell you what company the VHS was released under. It might have been also been a bootleg.
Yeah, no, I don't think it had like anything that would appear like that legit looking until the Synapse one. And then I
Right.
think there's been some issue where no one's been able to do a Blu-ray for reasons to do, I think, with elements or something. I'm not quite clear what happened, because I know there's a demand for a Blu-ray, and I think that labels are trying to make it happen, but I don't know. But this is a personal favorite of mine as well. I think it's like Alice in Wonderland meets lesbian vampire movie, kind of.
Yep.
Kind of, it feels like very much like a dark fairy tale. I mean, especially with that, in that official title, Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural. I mean, that's perfect. I mean, it's a little long for the marquee, but it's perfect way to sum up the feeling of it. It's weird. That's the only film that Richard Blackburn ever directed. He co-wrote Eating Raoul, which I remember seeing.
Which this is like, there's actually movies on here that sort of remind me of Eating Raoul, and this is not one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, it does have some purposely funny bits.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is sort of about a healthy distrust of the status quo, I suppose. They both have that kind of theme.
Yeah.
About, I mean, I don't want to read deeper meaning into Beyond the Obvious, which is the, like you said, lesbian vampire part. But it kind of feels like it's a little bit about maturing themes in pop culture, American pop culture. Like on the surface, it's about an angelic child wandering into the world of adult predators. But it's sort of like everyone's a potential threat the more that the audience is more aware of it than she is, which goes what you said, it's Alice in Wonderland basically.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason I'm really, that's another one of my things is Alice in Wonderland variants. So the idea of Alice surviving Wonderland because she's polite to people has always been interesting to me. It's really more of a thing in the Disney version, but still, it's sort of a kind of ongoing thing. And same thing. Other like what's it called? Spirited Away has that kind of thing where she survives this Alice in Wonderland situation because she just goes along with it. Labyrinth is about a young girl sort of learning to be polite to get her way through. Pan's Labyrinth also has that kind of going on. It's just, it's the Alice in Wonderland thing is great. And so I do think that there's a little bit about that we not just about, like, Alice in Wonderland is about women maturing, girls maturing to women. And I think that this movie has a kind of, this is about pop culture ideas maturing.
Do you are you reminded at all of Italian horror with the look of this at all? Because I think of Bava and even things Argento does later a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's there's a lot of Kill Baby Kill, Baron of Blood kind of. Oh, and actually, now that I think about it, one Lisa and the Devil has a lot of this sort of. That's a more decorative movie than this, but there's a similar kind of vibe. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because that was another thing that struck me when I saw it, because it does, I mean, that and another film from 1973 that we'll be talking about do feel like, I mean, like European horror in a good way in places, in terms of the creative lighting choices. But this kind of stands apart even on the list, because it's not like it doesn't have the same kind of tendency towards psychodrama as like some of these, but it's just so idiosyncratic, and again, like that kind of dream logic, like the way that it unfolds is the logic of a nightmare, like from the way that she, like how, like what puts the narrative in place in terms of, like, it's like a gangster movie for a second, and then it's like she's like, sneaking a ride into town, and like, encountering just like this very exaggerated, like horrible adult world. And then it becomes almost like a Disney princess kind of movie where she encounters like the Wicked Queen, but like with monster children and just weird singing old witches, and then it becomes like almost like like a prototype for those. I've never seen any of those underworld kind of movies where like vampires and werewolves are doing battle, but like
Right.
it feels like almost setting the stage for that kind of like, exaggerated like monster fantasy kind of battling.
And it has a really long kind of climactic chase
Yes.
that kind of feels like filler, but is so nicely photographed that I don't mind.
Yeah, no, it feels like very much like a let's put on a show kind of,
Hmm.
production. I remember finding a newspaper article from the shoot of it, like, looking for it on newspapers.com. And again, like Premonition, I think it's also like, a young guy wanted to break into films and like his dad helped getting the money. I think
Hmm.
Premonition was kind of the same way. And I just always thought it was such a shame because the way a lot of these films worked, like they were self-starters, like a lot of them, and they were kind of at the mercy of fairly unscrupulous distributors. I mean, John Hancock, sold his to Paramount. It's a little different, but like some of
Hmm.
these just, dealing with like these kind of maybe slightly dodgy kind of distributor types, and then dealing with like shady sub distributors, and so a lot of them lost their shirt or they just didn't see any money from these things. And I think
Yeah.
Lemora was one of those situations where it just ran into so many problems.
And it didn't have like that Texas Chainsaw Massacre thing where it was a success, but the mob stole all the money or whatever the
Right.
rumor is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, it's not quite as extreme as that. But I mean, and Lemora was the kind of thing that because it wasn't as explicit or harrowing as a Hooper film, it was
Hmm.
able to make the transition to like late show. So
Yeah.
I think a few of these, um, Let's Get Jessica Together was another one. These were perfect like late show kind of fodder because they didn't have a lot of nudity and gore. And so they
Hmm.
could be just you're up at 3 a.m. Let's put on something with vampires, and this is perfect, and you feel like you're dreaming it anyway.
Yeah, and it is the kind of thing. I mean, knowing that Cheryl Rainbow Smith ended up in sexploitation, she is almost certainly underaged when she made this movie.
I'm not
Um,
sure if she was. I think
she
she
was she was on the verge, maybe.
okay, because I
um,
think she even offered to do nudity for it.
yeah, and so, but it does come like they would be very easy to add nudity and sex to this particular movie,
Yeah.
and it sometimes feels it comes dangerously close. There's all these movies based on the Marquis de Sade Justine
Hmm.
about innocent girl corrupted by debauchery. There's the less likable Polanski movie, What,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
which is incredibly uncomfortable knowing what we know about Roman Polanski now.
Sure. Yeah.
That so, but there's this sort of child coding in Alice in Wonderland character that could be pretty exploitative. So they definitely had the chance to make
Yeah,
this.
I'm kind of relieved that they didn't try to
Yeah,
make this sexy, like in an explicit way, because yeah,
right.
it kind of is on the verge of being a little bit squirm-inducing. But
Yeah,
they do. Yeah, they don't cross any lines in terms of like R-rated material in this, and I think
no.
that kind of makes it a little more palatable. Really.
Yeah, I believe the version I watched on YouTube claimed it was PG-13, which I'm sure is bullshit. It doesn't have a rating. But yeah, it feels like
I think it was a PG film though. I don't think.
yeah,
Yeah, I think. What was
that
the?
would make sense.
Yeah, I think a few of these were PG.
Well,
Actually,
God, we're gonna one we're gonna talk about was PG, and I was a little shocked by. But no, this one is and part of actually what makes it a little upsetting is the fact that you keep being afraid it's gonna do something naughty, and then it never does, and which is kind of the theme. I think what I meant to say earlier when I was trying to gather my thoughts about what feels like Blackburn's thing is I think he's not necessarily anti-religious. I guess the Catholic League of Decency saw this movie and thought it was very anti-Catholic.
yeah, they did.
Um, and I think that he is a little more anti-naivete, and this is sort of like, um, it's sort of like the character. Lena is the name of the Lemora is the sort of vampiress that she's meeting. But there is something about her sort of leaving behind naivete that it is sort of a sort of that satisfying theme to the whole thing, which I guess is again Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. No, it's I mean I don't know if I have too much more to add on this one that you haven't already
mhm.
said, but it's it's one of the great, jewels of American independent horror of that period, I think. And I hope that they can sort out the situation with the Blu-ray one day.
Yeah. I guess. Oh, and the other thing is I've never seen this, but it gets compared to the Czech film Valerie and Her Weekend of Wonders.
Yeah, Valerie and Her Week of Wonders. It definitely, and I mean that's a film that I know some reviews, like the Onion AV Club, were a little bit unnerved by the fact that does have that kind of more sexualized kind of take on the character. But I mean, that's a great film in its own right, and full of striking imagery. I think. They make an interesting double bill. I mean, and you can find that one pretty easily. I think the Criterion Collection put it out here.
It's probably on Criterion Channel, and I just need to actually watch it.
Yeah, no, you definitely would not be bored with it.
Yeah. And then the only other thing I had written down is that the Wikipedia fact claimed that this was made based on that Blackburn made this based on the success of Count Yorga, and I can't really see it.
I've heard that too. I think Richard Harlan Smith makes that point in the booklet that came with Synapse's release. And I think that just, what that means is that Count Yorga was 1970 and made a bunch of money as a vampire movie. And that is maybe all that means. I don't think they were like trying to tell, a story that was similar, just using vampires. Which I love is, just because vampires, inform half these stories, and it's such a diverse slate of films. It's the opposite of, the influence of slasher movies. Friday the 13th inspired a lot of movies that I love, but a lot of films that like fall within a certain template. And vampires, it's such a broader scope. I mean, you can do so many different kind of stories that, even ones that we're not talking about today, like Martin, that feel like pretty unique, but I guess could be post Yorga films also.
Yeah, maybe it's just that Yorga just didn't have a huge impact on me.
I'm not like I have friends that are big into Count Yorga Vampire. I don't dislike it. I mean, it's fine, but it's I think it might surprise people how much of a success it was, considering how it doesn't linger in the imagination as much as some of these more offbeat films.
Right.
But at the time, I mean, it would have been the kind of film that could kid the vampire mythology in a way that was kind of fresh. Because, I mean, even more than like an Altman, I mean, it had Michael Murphy from the Altman films, but it was the kind of film that was trying to be a hip contemporary American film, but dealing with horror subjects. Not quite as extreme as something like Scream, but it was horror for like a new generation, in self-aware, maybe.
Right. I guess I end up preferring the Hammer approach to that, which I think a lot of people thought was a total flop.
With the Dracula AD?
But I think that stuff actually ends up aging better because it was kind of a flop in far as mixing the two. I don't know. I guess we're not really talking about Count Yorga right now. I just thought the comparison was strange, but you're right. It's just because it's a vampire thing.
I think so, yeah.
And we're going to end part 1 right there. Stay tuned for part 2 in 1 month. It's going to be a little bit longer, and I apologize because my voice sounds significantly worse by the end. In the meantime, I'd like to apologize to Bill because even after doing 2 takes, I still mispronounced his name as Ackerman instead of Ackerman. You can hear him laugh a little at my faux pas at the beginning there. But also like to say the person I should have credited with the concept of M. Giallo versus F. Giallo was author Michael Mackenzie. Until next time, you can reach me on the Genre Grinder website, the Genre Grinder Facebook page, at Genre Grinder on Twitter, and at Gabe M as in Matthew Powers on Twitter. Thanks for listening.
I wanna hear her scream